Hello, leaders of the world. Welcome to Spread Love and Organizations, a podcast for purpose-driven healthcare leaders striving to make life better around the world by leading their teams with genuine care, servant leadership, and love. I am Naji, your host for this episode, joined today by Dr. Umbereen Nehal, a pediatrician by training and current MIT Sloan Fellow MBA candidate. Umbereen is a former Medicaid medical director and a former chief medical officer for a 14-center community health organization in New York City. Educated at Aga Khan University, Baylor College of Medicine, and Harvard School of Public Health, she has been named a top voice 4 times by LinkedIn. Clinical lead for a $1.8 billion in new funding for Medicaid reform to value-based care. She was recognized by President Obama for a healthcare enrollment campaign for the White House. She is published in many areas, in quality improvement business models for AI in healthcare, trauma-informed refugee health, and medical education for patient-centered care. Umbereen, I'm so excited to have you with me today.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
First, I would love to hear your personal story, the in between the lines of your incredible journey you've had so far.
Yeah, thank you. So I do come from a physician family. So in my family, if by age 18, you don't have your whole life planned out for you, your father sends you off to medical school in Pakistan, which is what happened to me. So I would wish I had a super inspiring story to tell you about why I became a physician. But it's because I wasn't decisive enough early enough for my dad. But I will say, though, that I realized that I grew up with a great aunt who was a women's health surgeon in Pakistan, who founded and ran her own clinic and her own hospital and even employed male physicians. And she served both the elite and refugees. So I actually sometimes don't even realize why I'm doing the things that I do. How did I get into refugee health? I realized that I grew up seeing that on visits to Pakistan. And my perspective on leadership, and particularly, as you mentioned, servant leadership, is very much in a global health perspective, not defined only by American healthcare. And I think, for instance, a very famous physician, philosopher, and scientist, Maimonides, was a Jewish physician in the Middle Ages who lived in Arab lands because he escaped, I believe, persecution. Really talks about servant leadership and humanism. And I think that probably defines my approach, which then probably explains how I've ended up in so many different roles. It's really been about my seeing problems and being frustrated on behalf of those who are suffering. Sometimes, frankly, a little naively, my belief that people just aren't getting it in terms of the incentives or what we're supposed to be doing. Let me get above the problem, get into the room so that I can wrestle these big problems with people. And then on occasion, I get into the room and I realize, the perverse incentives are what are driving these issues. And perhaps, some people might need a little bit more servant leadership approach rather than delivering on the KPIs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And thanks for sharing your part of your story and journey. And part of it, as you said, you've been focused on working in global health. You've done public health. You've been a physician. You worked on policies. You worked also in more private. I'd love to hear from you if you see some sort of common leadership thread that you are taking from all those different sectors as you now think about leadership in healthcare.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the way we know each other is that we've both been at the MIT Sloan program pursuing MBAs for mid-career. Mine was a Sloan Fellows program, which is a particularly global program. And I will say that one of the things as I think about the different roles that I've had. For instance, when I worked for Medicaid, I was government. In fact, I couldn't use the word I because I was representing an agency and I needed to depersonalize myself. As compared to when I was recognized by President Obama, that's when I was very much myself My dad actually came in very useful because he helped me get speaking arrangements at various faith centers, masjids around America, because I was part of a large national coalition through faith-based and community-based centers. So I was working outside the system, and I was doing a lot of grassroots organizing, which was probably quite appropriate on behalf of the president, who himself was a grassroots organizer. So one of the themes I see, whether it's globally or domestically in the United States, is the choice that you make as to whether you're going to work within large systems for impact through government, through a large corporation, or are you going to go out on your own, form a nonprofit, be an entrepreneur, have less institutional support, but less of a matrix system, less of the politics, and more freedom. But again, then you have to have a lot of grit, you have a lot of determination, you have to create everything yourself, and you have to recognize that you're going to be disrupting an industry and potentially a threat to large players. So how are you going to either create new value, or are you going to outcompete the big players?
Another thing you're passionate about, right, and you shared it, we discussed quite a bit about it, is health equity. So yes. You've been active with it through the different roles, but also today, and obviously through the COVID pandemic, we also those challenges coming, to life through different lenses, and well, people are more aware about it, which is the positive side, but unfortunately, we still don't have solutions. So I would love first to hear from you. How do you define health equity? I know you have different lenses on this. So I'd love to hear from your side a definition, and then what are you doing and what can we do to make sure that we're building a more equitable healthcare system?
Yeah, so another great question. I think the terms are going to mean different things to different people. So I've been on both sides of this in terms of defining terms when I've been in medical education, and then on the payer side, just being like, show me the results. I don't really care, how you want to use this word versus that word. Although, to be totally fair, when you say deliver results, somebody is defining the deliverables, right? In quality metrics, you're defining the numerator and the denominator, right? So that gets pretty dicey. So the kind of butterfly and unicorn type of, to be a little, poke a little fun at this, definition that we like to put on our, diversity statements. Ultimately, what matters is how are you defining the numerator and the denominator for quality metrics, right? And so who is included, who is not included, who is at the table? So, for instance, I believe it was Toni Morrison who said definitions belong to the definers, not to the defined. So to me, whether you call it justice, whether you call it equity, whether you call it equality, diversity, I am not wedded to any term or any definition. I think there's a lot of different ones you can come up with. My preferred approach is a stakeholder engagement, community engaged approach. I would rather, if this is an issue, I would rather get the appropriate stakeholders together, ensuring they represent every age, ethnicity, profession, zip code, whoever's affected, and get them together and get them, because when people are involved from the ground up, from the very beginning of building something, they are engaged. And when they are engaged, you get buy-in. And when you get buy-in, you have the personal resources that come to play that help you achieve results beyond what you can get with just the funding or just the expertise.
So getting the different stakeholders, as you're saying, together, right, is definitely something we saw somehow in, during the pandemic as we developed vaccines and other medications that helped us. What are your thoughts moving forward? Do you think some of those things are replicable? And even in those, we saw challenges. I remember you sharing, your personal story with me also on needing, like all of us need at some point, healthcare, and how if we're a woman, if we're from a certain ethnicity in the US, etc., like how we can be over-treated or not well-treated, right? What are your thoughts about this? Like, do you see things moving in the right direction from the different work you've been involved in?
Yeah, it depends probably day to day, sometimes hour to hour, how I feel about this. There's sometimes I feel very depressed, to be honest, and somewhat quite cynical about humanity. And then there are times when my innate optimism does surface, which usually, although I will say that I've been accused sometimes of being perhaps excessively optimistic, but I think that's the entrepreneurial spirit, right? So I would say that I've struggled with this question internally and with others. We may all probably feel, regardless of what side of the aisle you are politically, I'm sure no matter who you ask, people feel like there's been some progress made in some domains and some backtracking, and they're frustrated. I'm unabashedly progressive, I will acknowledge, but I think what happens is that change is difficult. Change surfaces conflicts that you may not have, or aligned or disaligned interests that may or may not have been obvious, and it causes pushback and it causes difficulty. So I do think I'm at a point now where I feel more comfortable with some of the intense fighting and conflict and seeming negativity that's out there in the world. Because I feel like there have been times, particularly as somebody who's worked in government, we come up with beautiful definitions, we impose it on people, and we tie it up with a nice bow and we move on, right? Reality is that, like I was saying earlier, unless you engage people, you're not going to achieve change. So I think we've made some progress. I think we're seeing some blowback against that progress from people who feel like they're being left behind. And, if even within the Sloan Fellows program, I have had conversations, for instance, am I underprivileged or am I privileged, right? So I am a woman, I'm not, but I'm not a Black woman. I, am at MIT, I have a Harvard degree, right? So how does that stack up against somebody who has a state college degree, and will their voice carry as much weight as mine? I might struggle with certain things, but then my, great aunt was a physician. She ran her own business. My great grandfather was the Chief Justice of the High Court under the British. So how does that compare to somebody who maybe grew up in Appalachia, first generation college? And I think that sometimes in our diversity, equity, inclusion spaces, we aren't finding a way to include all that intersectionality in the different ways, all the different facets of diversity or ways that people might experience barriers. And I know a lot of people react to privilege. I think maybe a better way of thinking about it are barriers. So for instance, I grew up in a family where there was perfect grammar and diction around English that helps me when I am in a communication or leadership role, that somebody who might have spent 5 generations in the United States, but has a more, regional accent, might struggle with, even if he's a white man, right? And so I think we have to understand those nuances and appreciate that when there's pushback that feels like it's anti-equity and, we get triggered, my God, how can somebody believe that? I think having the compassion for understanding what barriers they experience that cause them to have that reaction, if that makes sense.
Yes, totally. And I like how you framed it, the intersectionality. We rarely talk about it that way, right? When we think about diversity, we just think ethnicity, but it's, or gender, or, and we don't go deeper, right? And beyond diversity, what about inclusion? What about equity? What about belonging, right?
Yes, belonging is huge. So actually, I was just taking a class on diverse by design at Stanford School of Business. And one of the comments that was made by one of the teaching assistants is that lack of belonging is actually one of the most painful experiences. And that's actually why bullying, is a terrible outcome, can lead to really bad mental health or even people taking their lives, right? Because the way that bullying works is to exclude and to make somebody feel like they don't belong. And again, while that can happen based on gender, it can happen based on race, it can also happen to a little white boy who has autism and, doesn't communicate or, have the same, there's so many reasons why. And those experiences of not belonging can cause some people to have a lot of compassion. And it can also cause other people to have, maybe not the best coping mechanisms that impact how they treat other people.
Another piece I'd love to get your thoughts on is you worked with government, as you said. Mm-hmm. Any highlight, like one of the most rewarding things of this experience and maybe the most challenging piece as you worked in the government space?
Yeah, so I would say that you have the weight of government behind you, right? So you can, it can be used less responsibly or irresponsibly, but when I wrote, along with other people, following the correct processes, stakeholder engagement, all of that. But when I wrote regulations, they impacted like 1.6 million people on Medicaid, right? So that is just so tremendous. The downside is that because I think I have seen, I personally can kind of be on either side of the coin of privilege or barriers. I've been at the time that I was ending my time in government, I myself was on the patient side and actually had, during an EHR electronic health record upgrade, had actually as a patient experienced a near fatal error that almost killed me, right? So here I was tasked with reforming all of Medicaid, and I was down in the weeds, and I was so worried about every life. And to some extent, when you have that kind of awesome responsibility and you have to push past resistance, engage, whatever, but sometimes genuinely you have to push back past resistance. Ideally, you engage. Sometimes that is hard, right? If you have an excessive sense of responsibility, how do you turn such a big ship? And how do you sometimes how do you frame it for yourself? How do you sleep at night thinking about the trade-offs? Because every decision has trade-offs. There are going to be some winners, some losers. There's going to be some increased risks and some decreased risks. And so that I found very challenging because I think I took my responsibility as a public servant so seriously.
Now I'm going to go into asking you, giving you a word, and I'd love your reaction to it.
Sure.
So the first word is leadership.
I think responsibility.
You talked about servant leadership, and I know we discussed a little bit last time around this. So when you say responsibility, can you share a little bit more along those lines?
I think really being authentic in your commitment to understanding the needs of all stakeholders, including the ones who might not be useful to you personally for your political career or your career advancement, even the people you may not even like, right? There are those stakeholders that you come out and you just have to take a few deep breaths after a conversation with them. But they're human beings, they're taxpayers, they're citizens. So you have to have that commitment to serving everybody and putting aside your personal beliefs or interests or emotions.
What about diversity?
I'm thinking of a big jar of jelly beans of different colors.
Innovation.
I'm thinking of MIT, frankly.
And the last one is spread love in organizations.
Spread love in organizations. I had written an opinion piece around on quality measurement, and Don Abedian model of quality measurement is cited, but he has a really famous quote, or maybe not famous enough, about quality is actually about love. You have love for the quality of your work, love for your patient. In his case, he was Christian, so he also framed it in his faith, and a responsibility driven by his faith. So you have this tremendous love for humanity and the quality of your work. And then everything else, you work backwards from there. So many people think of the Donabedian model as process measures, structural measures, outcome measures. They think of it as a framework. Actually, Donabedian was about love.
And well, do you agree on those, those aspects of love in organizations, love in what you do, caring about the people around it? Are you one of those believers in it as you build those policies?
So I am a big softie on the inside, but I try to be very tough on the outside, just because. Because you can't let on to people. You're really a big softie.
And it's not one or the other, right? Like it's kind of both together.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I will say that when I was younger in my life, and even, how I ended up getting sent off to medical school, I was very much what you call a pleaser. I wanted to make conflict go away right away. I wanted to make people happy. I wasn't willing to speak up or fight. And now I'm on the opposite end of that. I think in part because I got into this profession with a lot of awesome responsibility. I had role models in my family. I had a role model, Dr. Feigen at Baylor College of Medicine, who was very ethical. He had more of a Jewish background. I've been able to see people draw from their faith, different faiths. And personally, I'm Muslim, and I also draw from a commitment to serving all humanity. So, but to me, if you do love somebody or you do love quality, you have to be willing to say uncomfortable things. You have to raise problems, because until and unless the problem is acknowledged, you can't problem solve. And until we problem solve, we cannot improve quality. And a lot of times there is a scarcity mindset, zero-sum game mindset that, we can't serve that population, no margin, no mission, all of these ideas. But perhaps the issue is that there is insufficient quality. Maybe we are cutting corners in the wrong places, and we are not funding with a long-term vision. Because my values have not changed, but I think I've developed some more maturity from the time I was 18. Now the way I manifest that love is by raising difficult issues, being, identifying problems, but then being committed to bringing everybody along as we problem solve.
Any final word of wisdom, Umbereen, for healthcare leaders around the world?
Yeah, I think that those who really come at it from a highly engaged perspective, values driven, we know that there's very high levels of burnout, particularly in the US after the pandemic, but everywhere. And I would say that while many people who are physicians or leaders do so because they really carry a lot on their shoulders and they're willing to, give yourself grace, have compassion. Understand that you can't, my mentor, Dr. Feigen, said this, you can do everything. You just can't do it all at the same time. Build coalitions, be strategic and intentional about when you align to avoid conflict and when you seems conflict seeking to problem solve. But give yourself that grace that you can't do it all at the same time while holding yourself accountable for the long-term mission.
Thank you so much for being with me today and for this great chat we had.
Thank you. Wonderful questions. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you all for listening to Spread Love in Organizations podcast. Drop us a review on your preferred podcast platform. Connect with us on SpreadLoveIO.com or on LinkedIn. Most importantly, spread love in your organizations and spread the word around you to inspire others and amplify this movement our world so desperately needs.